Secrets and Spies presents Espresso Martini with Chris Carr and Matt Fulton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Espresso Martini. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Back in the frozen north from spending a weekend in Florida for a friend's wedding. It was fun.
Excellent. You had some nice weather out there.
It was okay. It was good. It wasn't hot, but it was not really like shorts weather, but it was nice. It was up in like high 60s, about 70. I'm not sure what that is Celsius for
Lovely.
You guys, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know I've seen a few Instagram posts of people having warm Februaries in like New York and stuff. Yeah, we're having a relatively mild one here, but it's wet.
Yeah.
It's certainly wet today. So.
I'm back in New Jersey now, and the last 2 days we're up in like the 60s, which is very warm for the end of February here. But I think it's back.
Okay.
I haven't been outside yet, but it's back more seasonal now. Anyway, that's our weather report to start the show.
That's our weather for the day, yes. Indeed. Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk about things slightly more exciting than the weather. We're going to be looking at some leaked Russian documents about their threshold for using nuclear weapons. We've got an assassination of a Russian defector in Spain. We've got details on cooperation between the CIA and Ukrainian intelligence services and more. Then we'll move on to our Patreon-only show, Extra Shot. On that, we will look at recommendations for a shake-up of British intelligence, the arrest of an alleged member of the Red Army faction in Germany, and we'll also look at the conviction of a left-wing terrorist in the UK and a cyber attack against an Iranian spy ship. So there's quite a lot there going on in Extra Shot. To listen to Extra Shot, you'll need to be a Patreon subscriber. Just go to patreon.com/secrets and spies and pick the subscription level that works best for you. And also you'll get a coaster or a free coffee cup. So first off, let's have a look at the Russian documents leaks. I'll just go through this and I'll come to you for your thoughts, Matt. So this is based on reporting by the Financial Times, and I'm using an article titled Leaked Russian Military Files Reveal Criteria for Nuclear Strike. So key points are, so the leaked military files reveal rehearsal scenarios involving tactical nuclear weapons against a major world power such as China, suggesting a lower threshold for nuclear use than publicly acknowledged. These documents, spanning from 2008 to 2014, outline the criteria for nuclear responses, including scenarios like enemy incursions on Russian territory or destruction of strategic assets. Russian tactical nuclear weapons designed for limited use in Europe and Asia remain a cornerstone of Russia's defense policy. Despite the document being dated, experts believe these documents still reflect current military doctrine, indicating the ongoing relevance of nuclear strategies in Russian defense planning. The training materials reveal deep-seated suspicions of China among Moscow's security elite, despite the growing partnership between the two countries. Russia's military conducts exercises envisioning potential Chinese invasions, highlighting strategic tensions in the region. Russian doctrine is sometimes referred to as escalating to de-escalate, and it involves tactical weapons to prevent further conflict escalation. The aim is to shock adversaries into accepting terms or to secure settlements. This strategy has implications for global security dynamics, particularly concerning conflicts involving Russia, China, and the US. So, Matt, did you have any thoughts on these leaked documents?
Yeah, a few. It's so rare that you see these kind of leaks from within the Russian military or the security services. I mean, it seems like, I don't know, like every other week here, there's some minor enlisted IT guy who comes back from lunch with a headache or whatever and thinks I'm going to, drop all the crown jewels of the U.S. intelligence community. But it's very rare that you see anything kind of like behind the curtain as far as the Russians are concerned, like official documents. So it's just interesting, just to see this kind of a leak. I think it's seeing for them the bar to employ tactical nukes on a battlefield is quite low. That to me, I think we've talked about this on here before, the dangers posed by, let's say, an operation to like retake Crimea or some other like regime threatening action I mean, I
Yeah,
don't think
yeah.
it's not, unfortunately not really in the cards right now at this current moment. But I've said before that I think once the Ukrainians, if or once the Ukrainians are able to credibly threaten Crimea, to retake Crimea, that to me is when I would be most concerned about some sort of major escalatory action. I feel like that's when, the Russians and, Putin himself would see that this is too, the risks of failure here are higher than they're willing to accept. Um, and this doctrine, I think, really just kind of proves that. Um, by comparison, I don't know if there's a situation where the US would deploy strategic nukes without being nuked first. You know, I couldn't foresee a scenario in which we would do that. The other thing that's really interesting, probably I think the most interesting part of the article, is that how concerned the Russians are, to the extent that they would like war game this and put it in their doctrines, how concerned the Russians are about a possible threat from China. That, like, when I first read it, it was sort of, it just seemed odd to me. Like, okay, is that just like a placeholder? Because countries do that in like war games all the time. Like our U.S. war games are a lot of like made up fictional countries that are like thinly veiled versions of adversaries that we would face.
Almost
Um,
like Top Gun 2.
Basically, yeah, just generic bad guys.
Yeah.
Please don't be mad at us for who we're depicting as. You know. Anyway,
Yeah, what did they call them again in that? I can't remember. Was it the enemy? Or I can't remember.
yeah, just the enemy. That was sort of like the first one too. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, Chinese
Yeah.
box office is important. Um, but yeah, like that was a sort of, that just felt odd to me. But then I kind of sat with it a while, and I was like, no, actually, that makes a lot of sense that they would be
Mm.
concerned
Mm.
about the Chinese. I mean, I'm looking over on the shelf right there, the copy of Clancy's The Bear and the Dragon. Maybe which is about a conventional war between Russia and China. Maybe the old man had a point there, but I don't think a scenario where that would happen is on the cards right now. I'm trying to project a bit into the future. Like, okay, let's say one of the thoughts that people had following the war in Ukraine and like the sanctions that the Russians got hammered with, right? That their economy was so dependent on the Chinese that Russia would essentially become not so much a partner, even a junior partner, but a vassal state to the Chinese, to the extent that like the North Koreans are with the Chinese right now, right? Like entirely just dependent on them, like under their thumb, which is a bad scenario for everyone, the Russians included, and us, right? But like you look into that sort of a scenario in the future, and like let's say the Russians continued to pose no real conventional threat, right? And in many ways, for a major global power like the US or China, Russia, it's a considerable conventional threat, but it's not a major concern. Like something that like the Biden administration said sort of early on, like if the Russians use a tactical nuclear weapon or chemical weapons or something in Ukraine, basically said, we'll destroy the Black Sea Fleet and the Russian invasion force in Ukraine. And it wasn't a statement of like a goal, like we're going to try to do this. It was, no, we will destroy the Black Sea Fleet and your entire invasion force, and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So in many ways, Russia's nuclear arsenal is the one thing that keeps them, it's the one thing that keeps them a major player on the world stage, like an indispensable kind of a power. Without that, the threat just isn't really credible. Okay, so let me go back to the scenario here that Russia has been such a vassal state under the Chinese at some point in the near future that, let's say, the Chinese economy is, tanking for demographic reasons or, what have you. And they're looking across into the Russian Far East, into Siberia and Central Asia, and seeing all these oil and gas fields and these rare earth minerals, stuff that the Chinese economy desperately needs to grow. And Beijing says, why are we paying the Russians for this? Why don't we just go take it? That's a kind of it's again, it's not a scenario that is going to happen today or tomorrow or next week, or I mean, there's a lot that would have to happen to make this viable, but it's a scenario that's not, the jump to get there is not extreme. You know, like if you were to, I don't know, like look into the future and tell me that happens in the next 30 to 50 years or maybe even sooner, I wouldn't think that that's an insane thing to suggest. And apparently, based on these leaked doctrines, that the Russians feel the same way.
Yeah. I think I get the impression Russia's just inherently paranoid of anybody they're allied with, because if you look at the mid-90s onwards, the West was sort of seeing Russia as a potential new partner, and it seems to be, from certainly when Putin took over, that no, the West is the enemy, and they'd be waging a war against the West. As the saying goes, Russia's waging a war against the West, but the West hasn't realized that yet. So it doesn't really surprise me that they feel that way about the Chinese as well. I suppose you could argue as well, you know, a responsible military probably does have to draw up defensive plans for all sorts of scenarios, whether it be friends or obvious enemies and things. So there is certainly a case for Russia needing to draw up plans.
We had plans to invade Canada in a hypothetical third war with the UK up until World War II. Yeah.
Yeah. And they could be dusted off at some point.
If you want to go, let's go.
Canadians. Yeah. One thing I was interested by this whole document, I have a suspicion that it might have been leaked on purpose, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
It's near the Russian elections, and it kind of is talking about the nuclear threshold that we allegedly didn't know. And there's an interesting statement from Putin's spokesperson saying the main thing is that the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons is absolutely transparent and spelled out in the doctrine. And then he says, as for the documents mentioned, we strongly doubt their authenticity, which is a bit weird.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if this is some sort of thinly veiled sort of warning about Crimea, like you were saying earlier. These sort of leaks are sort of leaks that happen in America. This is sort of like the IT person you described, you know, who's libertarian, probably drank way too many energy drinks and seems to think Julian Assange is a hero. And they're the sort of people who leak stuff, and it usually comes from America. And there's been the only people who've made any significant progress in getting information out of Russia has been Bellingcat, but it's not really ever been military files, has it?
It's open source stuff that they're able to mine. I mean, Bellingcat definitely has sources that leak them stuff, like phone records and everything, that aren't quite easy to just buy, and then they use that to mine the information and plug that into other. But
and then Michael Weiss has like sources within Russia, but again, don't think you get many real documents, do you? I don't know. I may be wrong on that. There was something about the GRU he had that he's writing a book about, but this is kind of rare, and so makes me wonder whether it is a thinly veiled threat from Russia, just to say, hey, because there's been a lot of debate, as we've seen online and comments online, where people have really played down the threat of a nuclear escalation with Russia and Ukraine to the point where people were like almost saying on Twitter, oh, nothing to worry about, you know. But I've always been concerned about Russia kind of being pushed into a corner where they feel they want to use their nuclear weapons.
Well, you've seen a lot of the extremes of that argument on both sides online. And I mean, yeah, you've seen, and it's kind of used to make disingenuous points, I think, like to your point, like people saying like, don't worry about the Russians, like we can do whatever we want and, you know, they won't nuke us. I think the threat of some sort of a nuclear exchange with the Russians is very low, but it's not, it's not
impossible.
It's not impossible. It's something that is certainly like we've said before in efforts to, you know, give more offensive weaponry to Ukraine that would enable them to strike inside Russia or at longer distances and something. I mean, I'm generally supportive of those efforts, but I think it is worthwhile to pause and really think about what you're doing, because you are taking a stick and poking it in the eye of a country with thousands of nuclear warheads, right?
Yes.
To the other extreme of that, you have a lot of people on the far right and the far left saying, well, Russia has nuclear weapons, therefore you have to let them do whatever they want, because to push back on them means the end of the human race. And that's just like, okay, so we're hostages now. You know, so any
Yeah.
country that has nuclear weapons,
Oh,
they can
yeah.
just do whatever we want. Could we do whatever we want because we have nukes too? Could the UK?
Yeah, I know. I don't know. It's weird. It's so funny looking at debates around everything. And at the moment, if you believe the internet, you would believe that the West are just pure warmongers, and they're the ones who are like gonna do whatever they want. But when in reality, looking at it all, it's definitely not the West who are acting that irresponsibly. If anything, it feels like the West has way more measures in place to stop a nuclear atrocity from happening.
We have been so restrained in terms of like our stance towards Russia and Iran, especially in the last couple of years. I mean, to like the threat of like that the Biden administration has, okay, if the Russians use tactical nukes or chemical weapons in Ukraine, yeah, like the Black Sea Fleet, your invasion force is just gone. And to the same point, you know, with the Iranians, what we could do to them, you
Yeah.
know, within a couple days. I mean, yeah, there is second and third order follow on consequences and stuff, and it opens up a whole
Mm,
mess. It's
mm.
not a tidy, you don't just start it and then just turn it off and go back to, you know, the way it was before. But what we could do compared to what we have done as far as those two countries are concerned are so cautious to the point that we're sort of tying our hands behind our backs, you
Mm,
know?
mm. Yeah, indeed, and sort of becoming a paper tiger a little bit has always been my
Sure.
concern.
Yeah.
Because if your only response is to nuke something and you don't nuke something, then after a while your threat becomes hollow. Not that I'm saying America should go nuke something, but
Well,
you know
that's
what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, that's the Russians. I mean, it's sort of like it's not news anymore when the Russians threaten
Mm.
to, you know, nuke. Like there
Yeah.
was that one, I forget who it was, if it was Dmitry Medvedev or someone who was like uh, pointing out this like Bond villain type weapon that he said would you know cover the UK in a huge tsunami, which is just ridiculous too. But I mean, you say it so often, then it's just like, okay, Dmitry got
Mm.
into the Stolchi again. You know, okay.
Yeah,
I don't think they drink
exactly.
Stolchi over there. I think that's not. But anyway,
No.
you know what I mean.
Anyway, but yeah, I know what you mean. Indeed, indeed. You can tell these documents are dated because the one thing they didn't have was how a mutinous Wagner convoy could get to Moscow with little or no resistance. So,
Yes.
so they might need to update that document now. But there we go. Well, look, shall we move on from that one?
Yeah.
And you've got a great piece about the Russian pilot who defected to Ukraine last year and then was recently found shot to death in Spain. So yeah, talk us through that.
Next one I have here, it's by the New York Times. The article is called Russian Pilot Who Defected to Ukraine is Believed Dead in Spain. This article is a little bit old. He's not believed dead. He is dead. But
Yeah.
so Maxim Kuzminov, a Russian pilot, defected to Ukraine last summer, as many may remember, exchanging his Mi-8 military helicopter for $500,000. His defection, naturally, was considered treason in Russia, and Ukrainian intelligence warned him of the danger to his life if he left the country. Kuzminov ignored the warnings and moved to Spain's Costa del Sol, where he was found dead in Villajoyosa on February 13th, allegedly shot multiple times.
Mm.
Ukrainian authorities confirmed Kuzminov's death but provided no further details on the circumstances. The death is suspected to be the work of Russia's intelligence services, exacerbating tensions between Russia and Europe. Kuzminov's defection was part of a 6-month operation by Ukrainian intelligence codenamed Titmouse. He defected due to opposition to Russia's war in Ukraine and provided valuable intelligence to Ukraine. I think especially the electronics on the helicopter were probably worth.
Yeah, I think that's what made it special because helicopter itself is a very old platform.
Yeah, the Mi-8
yeah.
airframe. That's not a.
Yeah.
It's the avionics, the electronics, the communication equipment that was really special. Kuzminov's family was extracted to Ukraine before his defection, and he was promised a $500,000 reward for his services. Spain has become a haven for disenchanted Russians, with many settling in coastal towns like the one where Kuzminov was found dead. Chris, what do you think about this?
Well, God, multiple thoughts here. I think Spain was a very poor choice of places to hide. You know, as you said, the Costa del Sol, in the UK we call it the Costa del Crime because it's just the place where ex-English gangsters go and hide, as do Russian gangsters as well. And also you've got Malaga, that's like a 3-hour drive from where he lived, and Malaga is very much a haunt for both rich Russians and members of Russian organized crime. Now, am I right in thinking that the assassination itself hasn't been proven to be the Russians, but we know it is the Russians? And I'd put good money on it's either the Russian government or they've used organized crime as a cutout to perform the murder. And obviously he was riddled with bullets. It wasn't just 1 or 2 shots or a clean shot. He was literally, the reporting is he was riddled with bullets. So it was definitely...
Yeah, they made a statement.
Yeah. I think you'd call it a statement kill, I think is the term. Yeah, he definitely wasn't a liked man. And I think I said to you that I've noticed Putin seems to like ordering assassinations near elections. Because when I was reflecting on the Skripal poisoning, that happened in early March, which was just before the elections of 2018. And we've got now the death of Navalny and Kuzmanov's death, all just before the Russian elections that are coming up in a few weeks' time. Obviously, I think we already know the results of the Russian elections, but, and we say elections in quotation marks.
Yes.
But I think Putin just likes to project this image of that Russia has a long reach and he has a known distaste for traitors. And I think he's, constantly sending out this message that if you decide to defect, we will find you. Because I know the CIA have ramped up their efforts online to try and recruit disenfranchised Russians. From what I've seen of Michael Weiss's reporting, I think the US are doing quite well, the West are doing quite well with pissed off Russians at the moment. And maybe the leak we spoke about just now could be a result of one of those pissed off Russians, even though my suspicions are I think it's more of a political leak. But there we go. What thoughts did you have on all this?
Well, we were texting about it a bit at the time that the news broke, and I was thinking back to the episode we did right after the defection. Like the Ukrainians had a whole show of a press conference with him up on stage, identity, like there's his face, here's his name, here's him speaking about it in depth. And I think we said at the time that like this just feels like, does he fully understand the extent to which he's signed his own death warrant by doing this?
Yeah, I don't think he had.
It just felt ethically wrong with what Ukrainian intelligence was doing and how open they were in brandishing him specifically, Yeah. And there was a lot about the operation that just felt gross to me, like his crew.
Oh yeah, that's always bothered me.
Who were given the option to defect as well, and they resisted and they were executed. I think on the spot. Which it's war.
Well, I don't know if they were executed. I think a gun battle took place from what I read. I don't think they were executed. And also, they weren't really given a choice. The pilot made the choice for them.
They didn't know.
Tell them. And ended up in enemy territory.
His family was already out. Theirs weren't.
Yeah.
So they're not operating on the same kind of decision that he was. I don't know. It's war. Russia has been terrible in the things that it's done to Ukrainians over the course of this war. Terrible things happen in war. It's messy. I get all of that. But there's something about it that just felt, with that crew specifically, that just felt, I don't know, not great to me. I mean, okay, arrest them, detain them, interrogate them, and then, dump them at the Belarusian border. Or something,
Well, I think it's because they did start shooting.
Yeah,
because they assumed.
Yeah,
so basically,
you're right.
I think because the pilot didn't bother to even speak to them, and he literally lands this thing in Ukraine. His colleagues think that they're landing in enemy territory, and then suddenly Ukrainian special forces turn up because it's all prearranged, and they panic and they start shooting, and then obviously the Ukrainians shoot back. And they died, and I blame the pilot for that because, well, he should have. I don't know. I mean, again, this is it's not easy. How do you get rid of your crew? Yeah. 100 October, they faked a radiation leak, didn't they? So this is where real world versus entertainment doesn't quite align. Because how do you get rid of the crew? If he'd stolen the helicopter, I can't remember where it was based, so I doubt he would have got to the border. So they probably, I don't know. Maybe he should have found a way to get hold of the crew's guns before they took off to make sure they were not armed or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was messy, and it led to the death of, was it his 3 colleagues, and he
Yeah.
got away with it, and then seems to be living it large. It could have even been, do you know what? It could even be a family member of one of the crew who have fucked off with him and found him. I don't know.
Maybe
There is that.
I mean, yeah, and then to go to the Costa del Sol to, I don't know, live it up and
Well, this is
drink,
it.
and like there is
Yeah,
no
with fellow
more
Russians. Yeah.
there's no more wretched hive of scum and villainy if you're a defected Russian. Like you might as well just go back to Moscow and say, "Here I am, guys."
Yeah, I did. Yeah, it's weird. I wondered why he picked Spain. I can only assume that either he had a relative or a lover there, or it was an area that was just familiar to him, or he was just naive to think, oh, they're fellow Russians there, it'll be fine. I don't know. There's
a couple other points here. So Spanish intelligence was apparently unaware that he was even in the country.
Wow. Well, there we go.
So, they can't put surveillance on him to make sure that he's not being tailed by a hostile intelligence service, or to at least give him a defensive briefing, if like, hey, we've detected that, there are these GRU officers that entered the country. You should either get out or stay in this safe house until we handle it, stuff like that. Another interesting thing. So Oleg Sivayev, who is apparently Kuzminov's father, this is according to a Russian Telegram channel, he said, of course, about his son's death. Of course, I expected it to happen to him. A traitor is a traitor. I felt he behaved like a Judas, and at the same time, I feel sorry for him that he traded himself for spare change, betrayed his fatherland, his close ones, and added that he felt sorry for the crew.
And that was his dad.
That's his dad.
Wow.
I mean, to be fair, if his dad publicly voiced any other sentiments, he'd be charged with discrediting the military or treason or something himself. Yeah,
indeed. I can understand now. What I would say, just for anybody who thinks that maybe we're anti-Kuzminov's choices, I mean, I can understand why he defected, because Russia is engaged in this absolutely dreadful war, and I can understand why other people are wanting to defect. But the risks are real, and I'm just surprised he didn't because the Ukrainians gave him an option to stay in Ukraine; they could protect him, and if he went out of Ukraine, they can't protect him, and he obviously made that choice. And I was also interested as well, like considering that the Ukrainians and the Americans now have quite a good relationship on the intelligence front, that why was there no offer maybe from the US to offer Kuzminov or other defectors safe passage somewhere in the US?
Yeah.
It's an interesting one, that. I mean, maybe he just wasn't important enough. Maybe more important defectors do get that choice. Or maybe from the US point of view, it might be too provocative to hold on to Russian defectors. I don't know. But I mean... But with the WITSEC program and stuff, America's very good at making people disappear if they want to.
Yeah, we have CIA has it's called the National Resettlement Operations Center that does that.
Yeah, because what's interesting with this, obviously Kuzminov was used as presented as a coup for the Ukrainians, wasn't it? As we were saying with that press conference. But now this is like the counter to that, so it could put off would-be defectors, and I feel like the whole thing has been handled a bit badly, really.
Yeah,
to put it bluntly.
No, I think you make a good point there to I guess highlight that we're not criticizing his decision to defect. It's just how it went down. There's parts of that are uncomfortable, and that press conference, making him like the star of that press conference, I felt at the time was a very bad idea. And his decision to just go to Spain and just live it up, like he wasn't, one of the top targets for Russian intelligence. Is just it's. I mean, you don't want to speak ill of the dead, but this was dumb.
No, yeah, it was, yeah. So yeah, it was messy, and it's got even worse now. So he didn't even last a year after the defection, did he? So it doesn't. I just think from a wanting to encourage other people to do it point of view, I just think that was handled very badly. But maybe maybe he was a bit of a pain in the arse. The Ukrainians, to be fair to them, did offer him protection. And he chose to go in this direction. So you
can lead a horse to water, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe there was something about this guy. I don't know. But who knows? Maybe we'll find out more as time goes on. But I feel obviously sorry for his family and stuff and friends. But unfortunate end, and probably avoidable. Well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. you picked a great piece here that explains the similarity between US and China's current generation of stealth fighters. So, yeah, tell us about this.
Yes, this is an article. It's by Alex Hollings for Sandbox News. He does a lot of really good stuff. He has a YouTube channel as well that posts a lot of interesting. There's a video on his YouTube channel that's explaining the same thing as covered in the article. But this one's called "The Man Who Stole America's Stealth Fighter Secrets for China." So China's advanced stealth fighters like the J-20 and FC-31 are believed to have incorporated stolen design elements from American and Russian fighter programs. Su Bin, a Chinese national, pleaded guilty in 2016 to charges related to a conspiracy to steal American military secrets, specifically the designs for advanced stealth fighters such as the F-22 and F-35. Su worked with hackers employed by China's People's Liberation Army to gain unauthorized access to protected computer networks in the United States, including those belonging to Boeing. Despite operating a small company in the aviation industry, Su established extensive business contacts in Canada and the U.S., allowing him to gain access to internal networks of defense contractors. Over 6 years, Su and his team stole tens of thousands of files related to stealth fighter programs, including those of the F-22 and F-35. Su covered his tracks by using intermediary networks in multiple third-party nations to disguise the origin of the infiltration. Those are of like these defense contractors' computer systems.
Yeah.
His stolen information enabled China to develop its own stealth fighter, the J-20, which showed significant design similarities to American stealth fighters. Despite facing 30 years in prison, Su accepted a plea agreement and cooperated with American authorities, receiving a 46-month sentence. The stolen files, along with correspondence between Su and Chinese military officials, provided evidence of China's theft and use of Lockheed Martin design elements in its fighter programs. China's use of stolen design elements does not diminish the potential threat posed by its fighters, as effective employment strategies can offset technological shortcomings. Chris, what'd you think about this one?
Well, first of all, I found it fascinating, and again, thank you for sharing this. I mean, I've, over the years, a bit of an aviation nerd, and I've noticed that these fighters do look remarkably similar to American ones.
Yes.
It's interesting when talking to people about military-industrial espionage, because a lot of people don't realize that one of the points of industrial espionage is it can save money on research and development, and also provides an insight on the capabilities that your adversary has and can expose any weaknesses that they may need to overcome. And I remember, what was it, last year we covered a story about these ex-RAF pilots who were in China training Chinese pilots. And there were accusations that they might well have shared insight in Western tactics, even though the pilots denied that. But at the same time, their presence in China is concerning, especially as the Chinese government is getting more open and bolder about its intentions to reclaim Taiwan. So, it kind of fits in with that sort of that industrial espionage angle and wanting to know what the West's capabilities are and being able to match them. We've seen China's been building up its military to match the US. And I was also interested in like the spy side of it, because Su Bin used his cover as an aviation entrepreneur to make connections in the aviation industry. And even though the American and military government said he was a small player, he was still, having conversations with big companies like Lockheed and stuff. And also, it looked like he was stealing information to order. So it wasn't like a straightforward grab the entire hard drive of Lockheed Martin and walk out the door. They kind of were shopping for info and at different companies and trying to work out what fit where. So from what I understood was that there are different components to the fighter built by different people that you need to then go to those different places to get the information. And apparently the information spread out on its own is not necessarily classified. It's when you kind of bring it all together, it becomes classified. So that was quite interesting. And so like one of the issues that they were trying to find a solution for was to do with the turbofan technology for the engines. And so Su Bin made contact with a company called GE, who helped Pratt & Whitney develop the engine for the F-22. And then he targeted GE to steal their data to overcome this technical problem. And I suppose the one last note as well is, and this is where the RAF pilots became relevant, is you can steal tech and all that and rebuild something, but you also kind of need the skills to operate it to go with it. So, you might be able to assemble this wonderful new stealth fighter, but unless you've kind of got the kind of tactics and experience to go with it, then it is just a kind of glorified paperweight,
Yeah.
isn't it? So, but yeah, Matt, any thoughts for you on this?
Yeah, first you make an interesting point about, I guess, the experience or lack thereof of Chinese pilots, and that's,
Mm.
I think, I don't want to assume, but it's perhaps an issue across the entire PLA that in modern times they've not faced any combat whatsoever. Like no one in their armed forces has seen combat, in an actual war setting that counts for something, you know? I mean, how much they train and war game and modernize their technology in preparation for a great power conflict is one thing. But, when it comes to pilots, specifically combat pilots, that sort of hands-on experience is something that you just can't teach, I mean, I think we sort of learned that going back to during the Vietnam War. The U.S. were taking tons of losses against Russian MiGs, Soviet-made MiGs that the North Vietnamese were using, and we started training our guys against actual MiGs. There's that whole constant PEG program out in Nevada
Yeah.
with quote unquote acquired MiGs
Yeah.
that you would go and fly. You would train against actual MiGs out on the range, and there was always that shock factor of seeing a real one in person, and the Air Force wanted their fighter pilots to go through that shock, not on an actual battlefield.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting you mentioned Vietnam, because there is an interesting extra sort of subnote stroke footnote for that, because Fred Burton mentioned in his book about the killing of the Israeli pilot by Black September. Apparently the US Air Force and the US Navy, so the US Air Force were having more losses than the US Navy in Vietnam, but for whatever reason the US Air Force didn't want to consult the Navy pilots about their tactics, pride or whatever, and so the US Air Force actually went out to the Israeli Air Force, and I guess it must have been their MiGs that they used to train the US Air Force pilots, and then it led to a better success rate.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I mean, I think also this article shows the sort of staggering counterintelligence threat faced by the FBI, and in this case, the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, that are posed by Chinese industrial espionage efforts, and I mean, like you have, you think of like the big three aviation contractors, so Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, but below that are tons of other subcontractors and different outfits that are involved in terms of like engine production, software, all kinds of stuff that I don't even know to think of, and that's hard to rope it together. And I'm curious if this effort so the F-22 and the F-35, as are the J-20, are all 5th generation fighters, right? They're out in the world now, we're currently developing 6th gen fighter programs, right? So that's for the US, that's the program's called the NGAD, or Next Generation Air Dominance. And that's an Air Force program to replace the F-22. The Navy component of that, it's the FAXX program, which is their effort to replace the F-18.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'm just
'cause
sort
that's
of,
been around a while.
I'm curious to see, or I would be curious to know, like, to what extent have these Chinese espionage efforts against these 5th generation programs, how has that translated to the counterintelligence that are currently being done to protect these 6th gen programs, right? So a big component of the NGAD, it's supposedly, well, it's not, it's going to have this. It's called Collaborative Combat Aircraft, or CCA, which are like going to be AI-driven loyal wingmen drones that operate alongside a crewed NGAD fighter, right? So like the Air Force wants to buy comparatively fewer NGADs as compared to the F-22s, because they think that these AI-driven drones will be kind of like a force multiplier, right? Boeing and Lockheed are still in competition for the contract. I think it's worth saying that there probably are Lockheed and Boeing NGAD prototypes sitting in a hangar at Area 51 right now, as are prototypes of these loyal wingmen drones. Something that so about a year or so ago, maybe a little bit more than that, but not too much further back, there was a new building that was seen under construction. It's complete now. There was a new building that was constructed at Area 51, and judging by the large amount of air conditioning equipment that's attached to the building, people think it's a data center that's connected to the AI programs that are that are going to be incorporated into these 6th generation fighters. So I don't know. It's interesting to me. Like, are they? Is the Air Force pulling more of these design and development and testing efforts like in-house into the NGAD's combined test force rather than leaving it in the hands of all these subcontractors? Like, is it easier to defend it if you keep it closer to the vest, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I guess there must be some sort of, like, when the government do, should we say, hire Lockheed Martin or somebody as a supplier, there's got to be some sort of protocol about how they protect their data that they must pass to
Oh,
kind of
sure.
qualify to
Yeah,
be a supplier.
there's, I mean, it's standard data protection, classified information protection procedures that are in place across, if you want the contract, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're able to protect your information up to these standards. All the Lockheed engineers at Skunk Works or whatever all have top secret clearances. They're, read into these special access programs that, each one of those prototypes are a separate special access program that, like, you have to have a need to know to be involved in.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating case, and I think really good article, and people should check it out because it is a bit of contemporary espionage history, and definitely going to be other cases like this, I'm sure, in the future.
Just to break the fourth wall here for a second, if listeners would be interested in hearing a show all about 6th generation fighter programs, the NGAD, that kind of stuff, let us know. Shoot us an email. It's at secretsandspiespodcast@gmail.com, or let me know on Twitter. It's at Fulton Matt, FULTONMATT. Let me know if you want to hear that, and I think that's something that could be arranged.
Get that organized.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for that, because that was a really interesting piece, and I've been always fascinated by that. So we'll move on to a great piece, I thought, from the New York Times, which is all about the partnership between the CIA and Ukraine's intelligence services in the fight against Putin. So I'll just briefly go through that and then come back to you, Matt, for your thoughts. So deep in a forest in Ukraine, there is a military base that, despite surface destruction, harbors a critical underground bunker. This bunker serves as a key intelligence nerve center, monitoring Russian spy satellites and intercepting communications. The CIA plays a pivotal role in financing and equipping the base, highlighting the deepening US-Ukraine intelligence partnership. For over a decade, the US and Ukraine intelligence collaboration has grown from initial distrust to become a significant defense asset for both sides. The initial distrust was over fluctuating loyalties on the Ukrainian side between Russia and the West, and after the collapse of the Russian-backed government of Viktor Yanukovych, Ukraine's new spy chief got on the phone to the CIA and wanted their help to rebuild the SBU, which is the Ukraine Civilian Intelligence Services, from the ground up. The CIA was cautious until Ukraine swiftly provided intelligence after the MH17 tragedy, which is when Russian-backed rebels shot down an airliner full of passengers. And this intelligence that they provided impressed the CIA and marked the beginning of that deepening partnership. And then that led to CIA-backed initiatives like the reconstruction of secret bases and something called Operation Goldfish, in which Ukrainians were taught about how to create fake personas and operate undercover. And there were tensions in this relationship. So tensions arose around lethal operations, which made the US government very nervous because obviously they were concerned about Russia's reaction to that. But as this partnership has persisted, it's contributed significantly to the defense of Ukraine. And and this relationship is still continues to this day. And the William Burns flew out just recently to kind of reassure the Ukrainians that the CIA are still committed to this relationship, despite US politicians like Donald Trump, who are sort of sending out signals that their support for Ukraine may stop if Trump gets elected, and certainly it's been halted at the moment by Republicans. So yeah. So Matt, any thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, it's interesting to see like the sort of irony in that Russian efforts from 2014, even I guess before 2014, but from 2014 onwards to kind of subvert, co-opt, or subjugate the Ukrainians, which is born of this belief that they're, working hand in glove with CIA and
Oh yeah.
MI6, or sort of the very efforts that push them deeper into the West's arms.
Mm.
You know,
Self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
in a way, yes.
Yeah.
But it's also it's impressive what they've been able to do. I mean, I think there was sort of an assumption heading into from, many people in the West that like heading into the invasion in 2022 that like the Ukrainian intelligence services were so penetrated by the Russians to the degree that they were just going to be like neutralized, and that was absolutely not true. Like the GUR, their military intelligence has been really formidable and I mean proven themselves, I think, to be one of the most effective intelligence agencies on earth right now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a really
definitely.
great partnership to see.
No, it is. It is. I mean, like, again, like the timing of this article intrigues me because I'm assuming, apart from the second anniversary, it's to remind readers in America how fruitful the relationship between the CIA and Ukraine has been. And I think I'm assuming it's hoped that this article will drive renewed support for Ukraine, and I hope it does. Though obviously, sadly, many Republicans have been blocking support for Ukraine or have questioned the support for Ukraine, and I worry that they'll probably need more than this article to persuade them. Now, one of the things that came out I was quite interested by was this sort of CIA training that's been going on. Apparently, they've been helping to train a new generation of Ukrainian spies to operate not only inside Russia, but across Europe and in Cuba. And I was intrigued by that. And I'm wondering, there's been this ongoing discussion for the last couple of years about the sabotage operations in Russia and the CIA connection to it. I do wonder maybe whether these Ukrainian sort of special forces and spies were trained by the CIA and now are the ones acting potentially behind the borders.
Yeah.
But without CIA sort of sanctions backing, because they would need presidential approval to be directly involved in that, wouldn't they? And I don't see Biden as a president who would sanction that in Russia. I could be wrong, but I see him more cautious. But
so there was this isn't the first time this kind of relationship has been reported, right? So it was over a year ago, I want to say. Jack Murphy, who listeners of the podcast, I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. Jack Murphy had a big article that he was working with. He was working with a major U.S. publication to run this article that he had done with, sourcing from inside JSOC and the CIA and stuff that was talking about the sabotage efforts inside Russia. Like all the fires and explosions and stuff at all their industrial facilities and really pointed out how it's I think there were a few European services involved as well. They weren't named. You could probably guess who the likely, I don't know, probably Poland, the Baltics and stuff. Again, I'm not saying that's who they are.
I would imagine Estonia.
Estonia, are involved in it as well, but using a lot of just really old-fashioned like OSS, SOE kind of like World War II-ish tactics, like arms caches that were buried, some of these cells that dated back to like old stay-behind units during the Cold War that would have, wreaked havoc behind the Soviet lines, in a conflict with the Warsaw Pact. That kind of old stuff that was taken off the shelf and being used here. Jack had that story a while ago.
It was December 2022. Yeah, because I remember it was around Christmas time because we had a few Twitter exchanges about it.
Jack had the story a while ago, and I think it was sort of the seventh floor intervened with whatever publication he was working with, and they lost interest, and then he published it on his own.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's an interesting one. Well, I think this is a great article. It's very detailed. I've got a whole load of notes here, but I think I'm gonna hold fire on any more notes. But what I would say is have a read of it, because I think it goes into the history of since about 2014 when this partnership was created. And I think, as you were saying a little bit earlier, Matt, about this sort of Putin and his self-fulfilling prophecy, Putin became sort of obsessed with Ukraine getting closer to the West, and then he pushed them closer to the West by his actions. So Putin's managed to increase NATO as well. Somebody jokingly once said online that Putin's the West's best agent. Wouldn't that be a twist? That it turns out that Putin was working on the West, which I don't believe, but that would be an interesting twist on world events,
That's
wouldn't
some
it? But
8-dimensional chess right there.
oh, damn right, damn right. And I honestly don't believe that kind of stuff happens, but there are people out there who probably do believe that.
Yeah.
But there we go. Maybe the end of is it The King's Man with Ralph Fiennes, whichever one that was, the historical set one, where at the end he ends up in a we see that like Adolf Hitler, Stalin, and whoever else are all working for the Illuminati, and it's just like, oh my goodness, there we go. They're going to rehash that conspiracy theory in a movie. Great. So there we go. Anyway, let's move on to our final piece on Espresso Martini. Now, Matt, you picked this one out. It's all about the another failed ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. So I don't know if you want to tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so this is an article that we actually had to swap out sort of yesterday. So I'll explain. Anyway, it's another New York Times article. It's called "Hamas Rejects Ceasefire Proposal, Dashing Biden's Hopes of a Near-Term Deal." So some key points here. Hamas rejected the latest ceasefire proposal, disappointing President Biden's hopes for an imminent deal. He was originally saying that he sort of expected to have one as of this coming Monday, which we're recording this on Thursday, so we thought it was imminent. Anyway, so Hamas demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli troops held hostage, indicating no breakthrough in mediated talks with Israel. Qatar expressed caution regarding Biden's optimistic view on nearing an agreement, stating ongoing effects but no concrete developments. Israel offered concessions, including releasing Palestinian prisoners in negotiations, aiming for a 6-week ceasefire in exchange involving scores of prisoners. Hamas insisted on a permanent ceasefire and Israeli troop withdrawal, while Israel maintains its goal of toppling Hamas in Gaza, leading to a deadlock. A State Department spokesman claimed significant progress in negotiations, pushing for a deal benefiting the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, the Palestine Red Crescent Society suspended emergency medical missions after Israeli forces intercepted a convoy evacuating patients and detained their workers. Israel defended the interception, citing intelligence suggesting Hamas members were in the convoy, leading to criticism and suspension of missions by humanitarian organizations. Humanitarian relief efforts face obstacles in Gaza, as we know, prompting international aid airdrops along the coast. France was one of the countries that was dropping aid from the air.
Yeah.
The World Food Program also suspended food deliveries to northern Gaza due to safety concerns, highlighting the need for alternative delivery methods like airdrops. Chris, what do you think?
The first thing that came out in my head was obviously this proposed prisoner for hostages exchange, let's put it that way. So Israel's proposing to exchange 15 prisoners who were convicted of serious terrorism charges in exchange for 5 female prisoners. The 5, I believe they're 5 young IDF soldiers who are still in captivity at this time, and these people they were going to exchange for them were, serious hardened terrorists who've done terrible things and killed people. And yeah, obviously releasing individuals like that is for the benefit of Hamas, not Israel. And Hamas still want more. Hamas are the ones who've said no to this current ceasefire agreement. And even though, if you look at the debates online, Israel will be blamed and America will be blamed for the ceasefire collapsing, but it's Hamas who are the ones who've said no to it. Because remember, the original article we were talking about was about the proposed ceasefire, which seemed quite optimistic, and then you messaged me, I think it was the next day, of, oh, the talks have collapsed. I'm like, I'm so shocked there. So what I will say, because I just think this whole this whole war is appalling. The death toll is appalling, and I'd like to see a ceasefire. But the debate in this whole subject sort of tends to ignore Israel's efforts for the ceasefire, and seems to also ignore Hamas's efforts to not have a ceasefire and to keep this conflict kind of going. And I feel very sorry for these poor hostages, especially these young women. And there've been reports from hostages who've been released that these women have been raped, that they've suffered physical and mental abuse. And even the male hostages have suffered rape and physical and mental abuse as well. And I don't know, I just find it really sickening because, I'm concerned both for the hostages and these civilians, these high number of casualties that have kind of gone on. And this horrible, horrible conflict just won't end. And there's no real good political solution because Biden's trying to do something, but he's just sort of pissing off all the Palestinian Americans and all the supporters of the Palestinians. And it's like, I don't know. It's the worst. Unfortunately, the Israel-Palestine situation is always the kind of third rail of geopolitics, and it's the worst thing to happen for anybody, especially for people killed. But to find a decent political solution is just a nightmare, and many people have tried. And I honestly have no idea what the next ceasefire agreement's going to be. But I guarantee you, on Saturday there'll be a protest in London about demanding a ceasefire. Yet they will totally ignore the fact that Hamas are the ones who've kind of screwed this particular one up. So yeah.
I think the disagreement here, again, I wouldn't say that the talks collapsed. I think there's just a delay in them, and there's not, like, we don't have a deal yet. But I think Bill Burns and the head of Mossad and the Qataris will, go back to the drawing board. I think the hang up has been along two lines. So it's what the Israelis will give in exchange for getting their troops that were taken hostage on 10/7 back, right? I don't know specifically, this may have been in the article, I don't recall. I don't know specifically who Hamas wants back in it, because like in the previous ceasefire, there were I think a large number of Palestinians that were released per every Israeli hostage that was released. But some of the people that, like, they weren't, like, the people that...
They were quite low-level people.
It was in many cases, it was like Palestinian, like, teenagers and stuff who were swept up in raids in the West Bank and everything. It wasn't like... These weren't like senior Hamas members. These were like just people in many respects. So, obviously if Hamas is asking for, more like serious combatants and stuff, that's going to be a debate. I think the other big hang up is whether it's a permanent ceasefire, which the issue for the Israelis then is a permanent ceasefire now would mean that Hamas remains in power in Gaza, which is unacceptable for them and Israelis across the board, versus like a temporary ceasefire, which the number that was thrown around previously was 6 weeks. And I think there was some thinking in the Biden administration that a 6 week after 6 weeks, it would be politically or militarily untenable for the IDF to ramp up combat operations again. Whether or not that would bear out in that scenario, I don't know, but I think that was the thinking. And of course, in the conversation about it, it totally just gets lost in the, black and white absolutes, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But the hope is that a temporary 6 week ceasefire in practice will become a permanent ceasefire.
But I just, having Hamas stay in leadership in any way, shape, or form in Gaza, I just don't see how that would be acceptable.
Yes.
We have to face that political reality. What they did on the 7th of October, had they done that in the West, we would not be accepting.
No, we wouldn't.
Them. Had they done that in America, we wouldn't accept it. I mean, goddamn, we toppled the Taliban over 9/11, and the Taliban weren't even really directly involved with 9/11. They were just supporting players. So we need to get real about it, really, because I think this has been my bugbear with the international reaction to Hamas for a long time, is that Israel's concerns always get thrown to the side because Israel's always painted as the aggressor, and somehow Hamas have been given a kind of free pass for a very long time, and then Hamas managed to do what they did on the 7th of October, and now we're in this terrible mess. But yet again, kind of Israeli security always seems to be, for many people, they don't give a damn about Israeli security. They think Israel should just go. And I don't see that as a realistic option, and
It's
I don't
not.
see that as a particularly good option either, especially for the Israelis. And I don't think that's an acceptable opinion either anymore, because Israel is a political reality, whether you like it or not. But then we need some sort of proper situation for the Palestinians, and Hamas is not that. Hamas is a terrible terrorist organization who do terrible things. They treat their population so badly. I mean, you talked about aid earlier. I've seen verified videos of Hamas just taking a lot of the aid away for their own people. As somebody points out, I think it was a former CIA officer pointed out on Twitter that one of the thoughts that crossed her mind was the fact that Hamas obviously knew what they were going to do on the 7th of October, and they prepared to protect their people, their fighters. They they got supplies ready in their underground bunkers, but there were no provisions for the civilian population at all. There were no air raid shelters, no food stores, no nothing. And obviously they knew exactly, by poking the bear, being Israel in this situation, sorry for the analogy, but they poked the bear, and Israel responded. I don't agree. I think Israel over-responded, but they did respond, and it was kind of predictable how Israel was going to respond. And Hamas knew that, and they did absolutely zero to protect the people of Gaza. And I just get so annoyed in the West when you've got people over here who are not under threat from Hamas, who make zero effort to talk about that. And it really annoys me, as you can tell.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, we've talked plenty about how just sort of exhausting and depressing this whole thing has been, and I think we're going to be dealing with the repercussions of it, even here, politically in the West for a long time. And the way the entire world sees Israel has entirely changed because of this. And I don't know that the Israelis have fully understood that.
No, I think actually, I suspect this has done far more damage to Israel than they even want to believe. I have a feeling, because you've got a whole generation of younger people in the West who will grow up to be the new political players. And I mean, we already sort of see it on the American left, the new generation, the AOCs, etc., who are not fans of Israel. And certainly about a year and a half ago, there were votes about removing or bringing down America's military support for like the Iron Dome. And a lot of far leftist and leftist politicians, it's sort of become this sort of cause for them that cutting off any American support for Israel is the thing that needs to happen. So let's fast forward 20 years' time. That idea might well be a mainstream idea by that point because of what's happened this year.
Yeah, amongst progressives, quote unquote normie Democrats in the U.S. Yeah, it's entirely possible that that's just there's been a generational within the American center left. There's been a generational divide as far as Israel is seen for a while, and I thought even before October 7th that this was going to come to a head at some point, in a primary or whatever. But this sped this up, and to your point, I don't know that Israelis, as are Palestinians, but Israelis are dealing with a profound sense of trauma. That if we lost the equivalent of 11,000 people, that would be the equivalent in the U.S. of what they lost on October 7th. If I know, holy shit, oh my God, we would lose our minds. Like we would burn that whole region to the ground. If that happened to us. And I don't think there's just a profound sense of trauma that they're still working through. And in that, I don't know that they recognize their image in the world how
No,
much of the
no.
world sees them now.
No, and Israel now have responded and created even more trauma because, I mean, the death toll is not confirmed because, again, we can't trust Hamas's numbers because it's Hamas.
Yeah,
But
it's
it's going to be large.
it's
You can independently say it's going to be a large
I think the
figure.
number that's been, and I mean, this is, it's reported by the Gazan Ministry of Health, which is, of course, governed by Hamas. So that's an asterisk that you have to put there. But I think 30,000 is the new number that's just been crossed. And I think there's a lot of other international aid organizations and stuff that have sort of, I think the number is pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I mean, unfortunately, there's a lot of fog of war over
Sure.
the cause of all those deaths because I know there's certainly been accusations that Hamas sort of bullied people to go in certain places that were known to get bombed and stuff and so on and so forth. But it's going to be a high figure, and it's,
way higher than it ever
don't
should have
yeah.
been.
Yeah, and I just don't see how that's going to help Israel in the long run. I really don't. But but again, just to put a point on it, I still think that the international community needs to take Israel's security more seriously. And obviously, with the rise of anti-Semitism and stuff that's going on right now, I think the Jewish people and Israelis feel targeted right now, and especially in Europe, there's been all sorts of things going on, and anti-Semitism has risen dramatically, as has Islamophobia. Islamophobia has risen dramatically, not quite as much percentage-wise as anti-Semitism, but still, there's so much hate going on right now. And what's even worse, so you talk about political repercussions, you've got Palestinian Americans and even some Muslim Americans who are sort of indicating that they're definitely not going to vote for Biden. And they're going to potentially allow Trump to return, who's Mr. Muslim ban.
Well, yeah, he said he'll send the military out to put down any pro-Palestinian protests and to deport any pro-Palestinian immigrants. So, great job, guys.
So that could happen too.
To that point, though, so I think it was on Tuesday. Was it Tuesday? The Democratic primary in Michigan was held, and there was a movement. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but there was a movement sort of amongst progressives or Arab American groups, rather than to support Biden in the primary, to just put uncommitted. And there were some even scenarios that, so like Dean Phillips is a Democratic congressman who's running against Biden in the primary. It's not a serious threat. It's more, showing concerns about Biden's age, his strength in the general, that kind of thing. There were some scenarios that, okay, could Dean Phillips pull an upset and end up winning Michigan because of, the lack of support among Arab Americans in the state. It was only 16% of the vote was uncommitted, which it's significant. It's not something to ignore. The campaign has a lot of work to do with progressives, young people, and Arab Americans for sure. But as I understand it, that 16% is in sort of alignment with past historical primaries. Yeah, it's not a flashing red emergency, that 16%, but it's also it's not something to be ignored either. That was a big test to gauge the kind of discontent in the electorate.
I think there's work that progressives need to do too, because if they keep ignoring the reality of Israeli security requirements, this will keep happening.
Sure. Well, I think then also that isn't this and I don't know, you've seen rumblings of this, like my conversation on here with Laura Rosen about the U.S. potentially calling for the U.S. potentially recognizing Palestine as a state under the Biden administration, or the efforts for Saudi-Israeli normalization and stuff. There seems to be, like, if anything good can come from this conflict, like, let it be like, let's grab this issue by the balls and actually solve it once and for all, settle the issue.
Yeah.
Get a reinvigorated, serious Palestinian Authority that governs the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, like, solve the fucking issue, because otherwise it's going to keep happening again and again and again, as it has been. And like the past sort of like the Abraham Accords, like the recent efforts with Gulf Arab states to normalize ties with the Israelis and stuff. There was sort of this belief that like you could just fence in the Palestinians and just sort of ignore them and make peace throughout the region without settling that. And I think October 7th just proved that that's not possible, So let's do the hard work. Let's do the tough, the tough stuff and solve the problem so that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree, because otherwise it is gonna happen again unless that's done. And yeah, so this is where I feel the international community has been failing for a very long time, and the UN has not come out particularly well out of this situation, especially with the whole UNARA thing, where that hasn't really been not police is not the word, but not vetted properly, and it's led to some very dodgy kind of connections there. So, and I think we said in the previous episode, I think the UN is very important, and we need a UN, because people love to criticize the UN. The UN has the unfortunate job of trying to bring the international, all the countries together and sort of come up with some sort of agreement, and good luck. It's like herding cats. But I always think we need a UN, and I hate it when the UN does get sort of tarnished with things, but this was avoidable, but it hasn't been, because the UN do typically allow countries and with zero pushback to ignore Israeli security concerns. And Israel's been asked to tolerate, constant rocket attacks, all sorts of stuff. And people over here describe it as like a fireworks. I'm like, no, these are proper rockets and things. And that cannot be allowed to continue, because otherwise this will happen again. So anyway, but I'm not quite sure how we can fix things. But what we will do is we're going to move on to Extra Shot.
One star.
We're going to be taking
star.
and we're going to be 1 star. We're going to be taking a look at the shake-up, potential recommendations for a shake-up of British intelligence, the arrest of an alleged member of the Red Army faction in Germany, and the conviction of a left-wing terrorist in the UK, and a cyber attack against an Iranian spy ship. So join us on Extra Shot. There'll be a link in the show notes below, and we'll catch you on there. And if not, thank you very much for listening. And and I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will catch you on the next one.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.